Welcome everyone to the inaugural Manton Lecture on British Art at the Courtauld. We're very pleased to see so many of you, students, faculty, alumni, supporters and scholars. I'm Steve Edwards, Manton Professor of British Art and Director of the Manton Centre. This evening we're delighted to launch the Manton Centre, which is made possible by the extremely generous funding from the Manton Foundation. Nick Sirota will speak in a moment and say a few words about Sir Edwin Manton and his role in the patronage of British art. Sir Edwin Manton was an important collector of British art and an unstinting patron of the art institutions in Britain and America. The Manton Foundation continues the legacy of Sir Edwin and Lady Manton in funding important arts organisations and undertaking of the charitable work. We're enormously grateful to the Foundation, the family and their trustees for their invaluable support that make possible the Centre. We would also like to acknowledge at this point the work that has gone into establishing this Centre on the part of the Courtauld's director, Mark Hallett, Caroline Pepper from the advancement team and Sir Nick, who's been consistently encouraging and supportive. As the arts in Britain struggle financially to sustain their vital contribution to our culture, the backing of the Manton Foundation enables Courtauld to continue its world-leading contribution to art history scholarship, curating and conservation. Let me say just a few words about the Manton Centre and our ambitions for it. The Centre fosters research on all aspects of British art as a dynamic platform for outstanding research and scholarship on British art and visual culture. It will offer a space for showcasing and nurturing national and international art historians, curators, conservators, critics and artists. The Centre is also committed to enabling students to develop into the next generation of professionals across their fields in the arts, and to this end we have this year awarded 3 Manton studentships, and we will continue to support postgraduates of outstanding potential with the aid of the Manton Foundation. At a time of great change in the global context, the work hosted by the Centre interrogates underlying assumptions about Britain and its legacies, with competing voices currently making claims on the meaning and values of what it is to be British. The Manton Centre is committed to forward thinking, critical and interdisciplinary scholarship. The Manton Centre for British Art also pursues collaborations with other scholarly and artistic institutions, both in the UK and internationally, fostering the network of researchers engaged in the scholarship of British art. The Manton Centre seeks to support a wide range of interlocutors. It organises a panoply of innovative events, artist talks, book launches, conferences, cross-disciplinary dialogues, lectures, panel discussions, workshops, and as I noted, it awards MA and PhD scholarships at the Courtauld and hosts visiting scholars. Tonight, we'll officially launch the Centre with the inaugural Manton Lecture in British Art in tribute to Sir Edwin and Lady Manton. The annual lecture will be presented every year by a leading figure in the field, and it's sure to become a landmark event in the British cultural landscape. In a moment, I'll introduce tonight's speaker, but before I do, Nick will say a few words about Sir Edwin Manton and the Foundation.
Steve, good evening everyone. And can I say what an incredible pleasure it is to be here with the Manton family and the trustees of the Manton Foundation to celebrate the creation of this, what I believe will be an extraordinary centre for the study of British art. I had the pleasure of knowing and working with Jim and Gretchen Manton for nearly 20 years. I came to know them first when I arrived at the Tate in 1988. Jim had recently made a big donation to the Tate that allowed the Tate to acquire Constable's The Opening of Waterloo Bridge. And that had come about because there was a curator of the Tate, Leslie Paris, who was a specialist in Constable, and who Jim had come to know through the 1970s, really largely, at a point where Constable scholarship was advancing. Leslie was one of the foremost scholars. They met, and Leslie helped Jim recognize that not all the paintings by Constable that he owned were indeed by Constable. And it was in gratitude for that that Jim and Gretchen made this contribution to the Tate, acquiring this magnificent Constable. Jim himself had been born in 1909 in Essex. He grew up in Westcliff-on-Sea. After the First World War, his family moved to Dorset. And at the age of, I suppose, about 17 or 18, he was bright and he won a scholarship to Cambridge. But he decided he had the wisdom, perhaps, not to take it up. And instead set off for Paris, where he joined an insurance underwriters, which I think was called Caledonian Insurance. And he prospered, this young man in his 20s. And he was noticed by an American insurance specialist called C.V. Starr, who subsequently became extremely well known and really dominated the industry. But Jim was spotted by this man, C.V. Starr, and actually if you go to Tate Modern, you will see there is an auditorium named the Starr Auditorium as a result of the Starr Foundation's gift to Tate Modern. Jim was spotted, and in 1933, at the age of 24, he went to America. He never came back. Well, he came back, but he never came back to live. But for another 70 years, although resident in the United States, he retained his British citizenship. And he felt very, very proud of being British and working in New York. And following his gift of money towards the acquisition of Constable's Opening Waterloo Bridge, he and my predecessor at the Tate, Alan Burness, developed this idea of having a fund that would allow the Tate to acquire major works by American artists and bring them into the Tate collection. In a way, it was an expression of Jim's wish to see these two countries come closer together, and in a way represent him. It was, if you like, a kind of almost a physical representation of his own story and his own life. And so from 1988 onwards, the Tate had, for the first time, an endowment, initially of about $6 million in America, which we used, the income from which we used to buy American art. And if you look on the captions in Tate Modern today, you'll see, when they're on view, great works by Louise Bourgeois, Cy Twombly, Bruce Nauman, Ellsworth Kelly, a whole range of artists. And that collection would not exist but for the fact that Jim had made this benefaction. The company that C.V. Starr and Jim founded was called AIG, and it was unbelievably successful. And Jim continued to work for AIG in one capacity or another as president and then as an honorary advisor until his death. So he worked with and for C.V. Starr for nearly 70 years. The company was successful. The gift of the Tate was given in the form of shares, which in the early years we decided we wouldn't buy anything initially. We would try and build the endowment. But the shares in AIG kept going up, and the endowment kept getting stronger. And eventually, in about 1994 or 1995, we started to spend, and the result was the works that I've just described, coming into the Tate collection. But Jim's interest in the Tate didn't cease at that point. In 2000, he gave a really significant sum of money that helped us do what was then called the centenary development, which opened in 2001. The remodelling of the northwest corner of what is now, and in fact the creation of Tate Britain. And he also later gave money for other purposes. And if you enter at the lower level in Tate Britain and go into the foyer space, you'll see a small portrait of this remarkable man. What it doesn't do, because it's only a head and shoulders, is give you any sense of his height, the spareness of his frame, his wry humour. And he was a remarkable man, but incredibly modest and very simple in the way in which he lived his life. I was reminded when we were meeting a few minutes ago that right to the end of his life, he and Gretchen lived on 11th Street in New York, and he would walk every day down to Wall Street to his office into his 90s. He was a really very special person, but I think he would have been really thrilled at the idea of developing this centre, and especially a centre that would have a relationship with other centres for the study of British art, whether it's in this country at the Tate or Courtauld, or the Manton Centre or V&A, or indeed York, or a whole range of other universities that I'm sure the centre will collaborate with, and of course internationally with Yale and elsewhere. It's a great gift, but it's already clear to me that without too many promises, it's going to be well used, because there's already an exciting programme which seems to be developing, and it's a great moment to be here for this inaugural lecture. And Steve, I'm going to hand back to you to introduce today's lecturer and to give the inaugural Manton lecture. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nick. I think that was beautifully done and a fitting tribute to an important patron of British art. So thank you for reminding us and sharing with us your knowledge of, well, for me, Sir Edwin, because I never knew him as Jim. So thank you again. We're very pleased that you were with us and able to share your memories with us. So let me move on to speak about tonight's lecturer. We're extremely pleased to have Iris Moon with us this evening to present the inaugural Manton Lecture on British Art. Iris Moon is Associate Curator in European Sculpture and Decorative Arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, where she recently curated the extraordinary and wonderful exhibition, Monstrous Beauty, a Feminist Revision of Chinoiserie. In my view, an extraordinary revisionist exhibition. I was just saying to somebody as we were next door that, you know, these are things that one's looked at over and over throughout one's life, and then suddenly realised that you'd never seen them. And I think that's one of the things that Iris is able to do, to make us look again, to think about things that we think we understand and think we know. Iris is, in my view, one of the most creative scholars and curators currently working on the decorative arts. Her imagination is extraordinary. She's the author of several books, including the edited collection with Professor Richard Tours, Time, Media, Visuality in Post-Revolutionary France, published in 2021. In 2022, she published the important book, Luxury After the Terror, and in 2024, the wonderful biography of the 18th century pottery entrepreneur, Josiah Wedgwood, titled Melancholy Wedgwood. It is, in my view, one of the best recent critical biographies of any artistic figure. So as you can see, she's very busy. Her research on European decorative arts and architecture has been supported by the Decorative Arts Trust, the Manton Centre, and the Clark Art Institute. Iris's lecture tonight is entitled Blue Milk, the Maternal and the Monstrous at Mary II's Water Garden. Iris will speak for about 45 minutes. After that time, we may take a few questions, and then we'll adjourn next door for drinks. So please join with me in welcoming Iris Moon.
Steve, for that really kind introduction. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here tonight in London to celebrate such an important event, and I'm really grateful to many individuals who have made my stay so welcome. I want to thank, of course, Professor Steve Edwards, Director of the Center, who organized the talk this evening, Alice Rafter and Layla Bumbra, who helped to coordinate its many details, and of course the Manton Foundation and the Courtauld Institute of Art. And funnily enough, I actually used to work at the Clark, so it was this kind of weird coming full circle. And it's really wonderful to actually see people from Williamstown as well, so it's sort of a neat kind of weirdly biographical moment, I guess. And finally, I just wanted to give special thanks to Patty Chang, an artist who was featured in Monstrous Beauty, and Patricia Ferguson, who is here this evening, for encouraging me to see 17th century delftware in a completely new light, and to the historian Joan Scott, who tasked me with revisiting the Monstrous when I was really ready to put it to bed. So, and I'm really grateful to have the chance to sort of revisit some of the themes of the exhibition. It actually ended in August, but I'm still sort of sitting with its after effects, and really excited to sort of explore some of the themes of the exhibition, which looked at chinoiserie and its kind of revision. And of course, a key figure in that revision was Mary II, who I'll be speaking about this evening. And interestingly enough, sort of like Sir Manton, was an English person who went away and came back. So I think there's a kind of interesting connection there as well. So I'll go ahead and get started. In February 1689, shortly after Mary II arrived in England to be crowned co-ruler of the English throne with her husband, William III, the Queen was on the hunt for a space of private retreat. Sailing to England from Holland, where she'd lived for 11 quiet years as a Princess of Orange, she had been anxious to return to the turbulent country of her birth, where her wrathful sister Anne remained, and from where her Catholic father James II had recently fled after her husband had driven him out in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. For Mary, family life was, to say the least, messy. In her memoirs, Mary expressed deep unease about going back home. Quote, "I did not sleep the whole night, but lay thinking how much I should suffer in leaving a place where I knew how happy I could be. I knew the persons and way of living. I had some reputation in that condition which I did not know if I could maintain in my own country, where I was now grown a perfect stranger." End quote. After being crowned co-rulers of England, the couple sought to escape the smog of London because of William's asthma, and chose to move to Hampton Court. The royal architect, Christopher Wren, began work on updating the Tudor palace in June of 1689. With simultaneous renovations underway at Hampton Court and Kensington Palace, the couple's newly acquired residence in London, and with William away waging wars, Mary sought refuge in the Water Gallery, the only space completed in her lifetime. Originally built in 1536 as a Tudor boathouse at the edge of the Thames at Hampton Court, the former pavilion of Charles II's mistress was renovated by Wren into a pleasure pavilion with a gallery, kitchen, dairy, and bathhouse, which Mary filled with blue and white delftware, known at the time as Delft porcelain. The writer Daniel Defoe famously described the Water Gallery filled with, quote, "a vast stock of fine chinaware, the like whereof was not then to be seen in England," end quote. While William ordered the Water Gallery demolished after the sudden death of Mary from smallpox in 1694, bits of blue and white delftware survive, affording us material glimpses into a realm shaped by Mary's imagination, her taste for extravagant luxuries, and above all, for ceramics. Surviving works include monumental tiered pyramids that could be taken apart and stacked to build pagoda-like forms with a vertiginous array of grotesques and spouts for flowers, muscular amphora-shaped vases with writhing snakes for handles, and monumental tiles for the kitchen that double as pictures for the king. Milk pans, typically humble and plain bowls with a lip used to separate the cream from fresh milk, served as surfaces for lush Dutch landscapes and dairy-maid rituals. European queens had traditionally used pleasure dairies, like the water gallery, to fulfill their rustic pastoral fantasies of being carefree maids. But in Mary's dairy, something else appeared. It was the birth of a style associated not with nurturing nature or the pastoral, but one tied to the artificial, the fantastical, the strange, and for some, even the monstrous. Chinoiserie was a shock of blue and the white of nature's milk. For my talk this evening, I want to explore Mary's taste for chinoiserie in the water gallery and how it mobilized a language of the monstrous alongside anxieties about succession, birth, and queenship in late Stuart England. Moreover, how might we reinterpret the material remnants of the water gallery as part of a porcelain imaginary that shaped the collective memories of Mary after her death? For while Defoe admired the water gallery and its material abundance, he saw the Queen's appetite for foreign commodities as unnatural, a taste associated with the excesses of faraway China, seen as a land of fantasy, effeminate luxury, and moral impurity, particularly in early modern England. Ceramics was a gateway drug to vice. Sorry, Errol. He wrote that the Mary, quote, little thought she was laying a foundation for such fatal excesses, and would no doubt have been the first to have reformed them had she lived to see it, end quote. He said that women caught, quote, the custom or humor, as I may call it, of furnishing houses with chinaware, which increased to a strange degree afterwards, piling their china upon the tops of cabinets, scrutoirs, and every chimney piece, to the tops of the ceilings, and even setting up shelves for their chinaware, where they wanted such places, till it became a grievance in the expense of it and even injurious to their families and estates, end quote. Though Mary bore no heir to the Stuart throne, she instead gave birth to a fervent taste among women for chinoiserie. So what happens when we lean into the weirdness of Defoe's words and the idea of Mary as having, quote, birthed the taste for chinoiserie in England through her obsession with these artificial and foreign ceramic bodies? Outside of royal lineages, can we reposition her as a protagonist in a story shaped from an undisciplined, experimental, yet intense methodology that reworks the past via the monstrous? I want to propose that we strategically think Mary's place within a monstrous genealogy of feminism. In Ernst Kantorowicz's famous formulation, his account of political theology is premised upon the notion of the king's natural and spiritual body, one mortal and one eternal. Queens had no central place in the monarchy, with women, according to one scholar, limited to just 3 duties, quote, to serve as a consort, to rule in the king's absence, and to produce heirs for the royal line. This third duty left them pregnant for much of their reign and reinforced their primarily corporeal, expendable image, end quote. But what if Mary didn't just have 2 bodies, but 3? What if the third body was artificial, inanimate, multiple, heterogeneous, amassed, and purchased? What if the Queen's third body was porcelain? Mary was not born with a taste for chinoiserie, but acquired it in Holland after being forced to marry her Dutch Protestant cousin William, Prince of Orange. In 1677, when she was sent as a 15-year-old teenager to wed her cousin, she wrote dramatically in her diary that she, quote, wept grievously all the morning. Subsequent depictions of the couple, this is obviously not accurate. Just bear with me. Subsequent depictions of the couple tended to show them as equals, as seen in the many delftware plates that celebrated their reign as King and Queen of England. They were, however, opposites. One historian sardonically wrote that whereas Mary was tall and graceful and someone who was, quote, thoroughly extrovert, enthusiastically indulging in the latest beauty treatments, bathing in ass's milk, for example, and running up astronomical dress bills, end quote. Her husband, William, was, quote, dour, short, bisexual, asthmatic, and chillingly formal. However, Mary quickly adapted to court life in Holland, developing a taste for the foreign luxury items made available through the court's strategic access to the goods of the powerful Dutch East India Company, which brought a wealth of goods from Asia via its colonial territory in Batavia. In Holland, William and Mary oversaw the renovation of the residences, newly building Het Lo while working with the French Huguenot designer Daniel Moreau to create a Baroque vision, later widely circulated through his design prints. A contemporary visitor to Hanselaersdijk, an orange palace near The Hague, described Mary's audience room as, quote, richly decorated with Chinese work and pictures. The ceiling was covered with mirrors so that the perspective was extended endlessly. The chimney was full of precious porcelain, part standing half inside it, and so fitted together that one piece supported one another, end quote. It was during this time that Mary established contacts with the delftware factories, including the Moor's Head factory and the Griquet factory, encouraging them to make large-scale works where only a few decades earlier, their primary specialties were kitchen tiles and imitations of Chinese porcelain known as crack dishes. She pushed the limits of the medium to new architectural heights. So this is not a historically accurate, but a reconstruction of placing these delftware pieces in the dairy space of Het Lo. In the House of Orange, porcelain had acquired maternal associations, primarily through William's grandmother, Amalia von Solms, one of the earliest European women collectors of Asian porcelain. Inventories indicate that Amalia was the porcelain collector, not her husband, Frederick Hendrik, as porcelain was only listed in her living spaces. She took an active interest in display. While an inventory of 1632 first listed 3 porcelain cups located alongside Japanese lacquer boxes, rock crystal, and silver pieces by Adam van Vianen at their Hague residence, only 2 years later, the inventory listed an additional, quote, set of shelves with 3 tiers, painted red and gilded, upon which to place porcelain intended for Her Excellency's gallery, end quote. Lacquer was often a glossy accompaniment to porcelain, and a rare surviving lacquer room made for the Leeuwarden residence of Amalia's granddaughter, seen here, evokes the spectacular effects of the lustrous material of coromandel screens, a type of Chinese lacquerware that was imported by the VOC from China, or the East India Company in China. Screens were oftentimes cut up and repurposed to serve as wainscoting, while English furniture makers transformed parts into mirrors. In a letter to Mary, who evidently took a shine to lacquer, court advisor Constantine Huygens criticized the practice of cutting up the screens, saying that they were, quote, divided, cut, and split asunder, and reduced the ways in which colonial trade privileged came from, or what they meant in an original context. This world of the faraway, fantastical, and superficial came to be synonymous with chinoiserie. Yet beyond these criticisms, porcelain in particular functioned as a concrete tie in the House of Orange between Amalia and her daughters. Since they could only inherit movable goods as women, but not titles or land, Amalia gifted her 4 daughters pieces of porcelain, which traveled with them after their strategic marriages with the Protestant royalty of the Netherlands and Germany. Her oldest daughter, Louise Henriette, created one of the most magnificent porcelain rooms in Brandenburg at Oranienburg Palace in homage to the House of Orange. Less market-driven, porcelain here became a maternal inheritance and a keepsake, perhaps the precursor to the tradition of women passing on their china sets to their daughters. And in fact, a recent New York Times article traced the history of a porcelain service through 5 generations of women, with the last inheritor having no one to give it to. Her sons had no interest in Haviland china. When Mary reluctantly returned to England in 1689 with her ceramics collection in tow, she encountered a political situation as fragile as her beloved collection. This was particularly the case in the wake of the exclusion crisis, when Parliament had sought to oust her Catholic father James II from the line of succession. With James gone, it sought to create the appearance of a natural and legitimate succession of power from the deposed king to the new rulers. Obviously, they didn't use this plate to advance that agenda, but gender was at the heart of the debates on Stuart's succession. A group of Tories argued that Mary alone should serve as regnant queen, citing the unfounded rumors that James's Catholic heir was illegitimate, and that Mary was in fact the sole and rightful Protestant heir to the throne. Supporters made reference to Queen Elizabeth I and said that women could rule gloriously, while the opposing side encouraged others to, quote, choose a king to go before us and fight our battles, which a woman cannot so well do, end quote. The solution of a dual monarchy was proposed, although unofficially, Mary was to be subordinate to her husband, cousin William. However, all acknowledged that Mary was vital to securing support of the Stuart throne because she was both first in line of succession and offered hopes of a new heir. The anxieties of Stuart's succession were actively mapped onto Mary's body. In the early imagery of Queen Mary, the signs of fecundity were central to legitimizing both her marriage to William and her subsequent return to England as co-ruler. As Catriona Murray writes, images of Mary began circulating after the wedding that emphasized fertility and fecundity, such as a mezzotint after a painting by Peter Lely from around 1678, a year after her marriage, which strategically used floral bouquets, bared breasts, and states of undress to emphasize her role as, quote, the future progenitrix of a new generation of Stuart offspring, end quote. The visual index against which her body was measured was in fact her Catholic stepmother, Mary of Modena, whose portraits were also designed to allow the viewer to read the signs of fertility, despite having lost 4 children by 1685. A portrait by Willem Vissing from that year pairs James II's wife stroking her long hair, a gesture associated with Venus, goddess of love, with a single rose fully in bloom and a female dog in heat, to persuade the viewer of the Queen's power to reproduce. By contrast, Mary, as Princess of Orange, had shed the attributes of fecundity by 1685, depicted instead by Vissing with a demure veil, the switch between veil and hair suggesting a contrast between Catholic consort and Protestant heiress. So here you can see the veil. Here. A later version added hair and an open rose to Mary's portrait after her stepmother had given birth to a male heir to James II, who would later be known as James Edward, the Old Pretender. Shortly after his birth, rumors circulated that the prince was in fact a changeling, brought into his mother's bed in a warming pan, end quote. Not a milk pan, a warming pan. And his father was either the son of a miller or a Catholic confessor. Propaganda prints emphasizing Mary's role as a virtuous mother and James as legitimate heir to the throne were quickly subverted by counter-images that showed the Queen being seduced by her confessor, Father Peter, while the little boy held a windmill, referencing his dubious paternity. According to historians, Mary had had 1 or 2 miscarriages in 1678, with the second one possibly having rendered her infertile, although she still hoped to conceive as late as 1691. Regardless, queens' and consorts' bodies were the sites of intense propaganda, with birth itself a highly politicized and contested issue. Mary's porcelain collecting thus emerged against the constant pressures to conceive. As the expectations of birth bore down on her public image, it competed in intensity with her desire to fill the nooks, crevices, and crannies of the royal residences with the artificial bodies of Chinese and Japanese porcelain and delftware. The renovations at Kensington consisted of her sizable ceramics collection. Nearly 350 pieces of Japanese and Chinese porcelain were located above doors, chimney pieces, pedestals, above the cabinets, and under them. Mary's tastes are visible in the drawings that the carver Grinling Gibbons prepared for Hampton Court. Large vases clamber for space on the mantel with teapots, miniature vases, and larger ones massed together. Cups and saucers on the cornice create a visual rhythm, while Gibbons framed small gilded shelves containing smaller vessels with wooden carvings of drapery. Gibbons's drawings suggest the range of sizes represented in her collection, corroborated by inventory records. Mary was also an early adopter of Kakeyamon porcelains, or Japanese porcelains, decorated with delicate blues, reds, and greens, seen in a pair of hexagonal vases, probably once owned by her. She valued her porcelain so highly that when a fire broke out at Kensington in 1691, the, quote, king went to his cabinet to reassure himself that his paintings were in safety and found that they had already been carried out into the garden together with Mary's porcelain. Porcelain featured prominently, too, at the Water Gallery, alongside blue and white delftware and furniture designed to match. It also included portraits, lacquer, and textiles. Defoe wrote that the Queen, quote, ordered all the little neat, curious things to be done, which suited her own conveniences, and made it the pleasantest little thing within doors that could possibly be made, end quote. He described a gallery of beauties with full-length portraits of her female attendants. The apartment, quote, for her private retreat only, end quote, was, quote, exquisitely furnished, particularly a fine chintz bed, then a great curiosity, end quote. However, Defoe paid particular attention to the ceramics, quote, and here was also Her Majesty's fine collection of delftware, which indeed was very large and fine, and here was also a vast stock of fine chinaware, the like whereof was not then to be seen in England. The long gallery as above was filled with this china, and every other place where it could be placed with advantage, end quote. Below, the water gallery also included a bathing room and dairy, spaces in which, quote, Her Majesty took great delight. Travel writer Celia Fiennes further described the water gallery spaces, noting that the upper level had a balcony that opened onto the Thames. Quote, the gallery was decked with china and fine pictures of the court ladies drawn by Kneller. Beyond this came several rooms, and one was pretty large. At the four corners were little rooms like closets or drawing rooms, one paneled all with Japan, another with looking glass, and two with fine work under panels of glass. There was a queen's bath and a place to take boat in the house, end quote. Whereas Louis XIV, William's great French rival, had used exotic luxury, reflective surfaces in architecture as part of the Baroque tactics of infinite extension at Versailles, the diminutive water gallery subverted this language of absolutism by using the mirrors to reflect the image of women ad infinitum. The 8 full-length paintings of statuesque beauties by Kneller recalled the Windsor Court Beauties, a series that Lely had painted for Mary's mother, Anne, Duchess of York, which hung in Windsor Castle. And while the Japan work referred to lacquer, the quote, fine work under panels of glass probably referred to the 8 extant embroidery panels decorated with the same Moreau grotesques found as printed designs. Perhaps this is the very same that Defoe had recognized as the Queen's own work. The majority of the still extant delftware made for the water gallery was primarily intended for the kitchen, dairy, and bath, tying ceramic invention to spaces associated with the Queen's body at labor and at rest. Works included a monumental pair of ewers on stands, which echoed classical forms used for outdoor garden vases, typically set on balustrades, large tiles with grotesques, and varieties of pyramid vases with multiple spouts for flowers. The most monumental is decorated with the bust of William III, as well as peacocks. The presence of William on the base of the tall pyramidal vase is curious. Delftware was indeed a strange medium to commemorate her husband, bringing his presence into the space while commingling it with other motifs such as the peacock. And while Mary was at Hampton Court, her husband would have been away fighting battles abroad, so perhaps the vase was a way to recall his presence while he was far away. Nonetheless, it is an unusual medium for commemoration. With its multiple spouts and exuberant decoration, a far cry from the military battle paintings, marble busts, or medals that were the common language of masculine virtue and power. Moreover, royal dairies were traditionally tied to female fecundity, not military prowess. Meredith Martin notes that for rulers like Catherine of Medici, the dairy emphasized the French queen's, quote, contribution to the state as distinctly feminine and maternal, initiating an architectural language of female political agency, end quote. Over a century before the water gallery, Catherine de Medici had constructed her own retreat at Nivois, a pleasure dairy that allowed her to couch her authority in a discourse of fertility, nurture, and milk, all of which, quote, underscored her contribution to the state. In milking milk, apologies for the pun, as a source of French legitimacy, Catherine was tapping into the early modern associations made between nature and a powerful female multi-breasted figure of endless fertility and fecundity, usually associated with the ancient goddess Cybele. Evocative of the marble sculpture by Niccolò Tribolo, a figure with her arms raised, nourishing France with her body of abundance. For lovers of blue and white Delftware, it is perhaps difficult to see the monumental examples in the water gallery as anything but beautiful, using the language of superlatives: splendid, wonderful, exceptional, exceedingly rare. But the water gallery grafted the visual idiom of chinoiserie onto the discourse of fertility that had shaped the dairy. And seen in particular through the prism of the pressures to bear an heir, Mary's accumulation of porcelain and Delftware acquires a different significance. For on the one hand, the multitude of pieces aligns with the images of abundance and fruitfulness that were meant to signify the powers of procreation. On the other hand, these ceramic bodies were unnatural, even monstrous. For the monstrous lurks even in the visually regal floral pyramids with the images of William, from the clawed feet at the base to the grotesque faces with sucking orifices. And seen again, the pyramid inverts Tribolo's nature, replacing antique Mother Nature's swollen breasts with a series of disembodied mouths, an orificial lack, an endless sucking desire or want. Set against the monstrous tulip vases, even the beautiful bucolic scenes pictured on the insides of the milk pan look weird, as if the puckered lip on the side from which the liquid is meant to pour is a warped distortion. What does it mean, after all, for a lip to suddenly materialize on a pan, to see figures where you didn't see them before? Recently, in encountering a 17th century Delft pyramid vase at the V&A for the first time, the contemporary artist Patty Chang, whose work often positions orifices and mouths as absurd sites of power and desire, looked down at those sucking faces where the stems of flowers would be placed and asked, quote, "What does it mean to have a perpetually open mouth, where the lips are pulled into an inhuman and disquieting circle?" I don't want to end this talk with a neat sense of closure, but to use Patty's disquieting words about orifices and openings to ask, can we recuperate the monstrous as another entry point into British art history? Mary was a central protagonist in the exhibition Monstrous Beauty, a Feminist Revision of Chinoiserie at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which sought to retell the story of chinoiserie and its long afterlives by looking at the fantasies, fears, and desires of and around women that accompanied the arrival of highly fetishized foreign luxuries from Asia and Europe, above all, porcelain. In pairing works by contemporary Asian and Asian American women artists with historical works of art, the aim was to show porcelain not only as a beautiful and coveted luxury object, but an artificial material that gave birth to pervasive fantasies, projections, and stereotypes around the exotic. Mary's portrait was placed alongside the American artist Jennifer Ling Datchuk's piece, Pretty Sister, Ugly Sister. Next to Mary's luscious hair and milky white décolletage signaling her fecundity, Datchuk's two white porcelain plaques float like part objects, carefully threaded through with Asian hair bleached and dyed blue to create a floral embroidery pattern. Hair here turns abject, as Datchuk envisions porcelain as a material deposit for excessive desires in an unpretty, abject body. Putting her work next to Mary, I think, liberates the portrait from normative narratives about tradition, lineage, and succession. Looking back on the exhibition, it occurred to me that my interest in the maternal and the monstrous was nothing new, but were weirdly recurrent themes in my work. I thought they didn't really have anything to do with one another until my son Desmond, whizzing by on his scooter one morning, yelled out functioned as a critical of bodies. It can also be a term of empowerment. Frankenstein's of discarded ceramics using epoxy and gold leaf, so the scars are highlighted rather than hidden. Feminist theorists such as Donna Haraway and Rosie Brodati have seen the monstrous as a way of questioning the naturalized and abstracted language of birth. But I think the monstrous has a particular place within the English imagination. I'm thinking in particular of Mary Shelley, who drafted Frankenstein, the story of a grieving man who lost his mother, who then decides to birth a monster from dead body parts. Shelley birthed the text of Frankenstein in the midst of pregnancies, childbirth, and losses of children. Looking at her notebooks, it occurred to me that every revision is in its own way monstrous, a way of suturing, cutting, and splicing parts together. Revisions can also be, well, they should also be productive. Leaning into the sharp gut feelings elicited by the monstrous, can we do British art history in a way that's not about the purity of lineages, heritage, or beauty alone, but about starting from discarded parts, the abandoned and the strange, pumping these parts with ardor and labor, and collectively birth something that has no name? Thank you.
I think you'll agree with me that's an extraordinary and wonderful place to start for the centre. So we're going to take 2 or 3 questions, and then Iris will respond, and then we'll move next door. So can we see some hands? Just 3 already. We're done.
Thank you very much. For personal reasons, I'm working on an exhibition which had its base in the grotesqueries of Nero's Golden Palace. Is there any connection, or is it just something that's natural to people?
That's a really great question, and I've certainly been interested in grotesques as well, and to know that there is a prior history in antiquity and an interest in the hybrid, the sort of non-normative. That being said, I don't think it always has to be tethered to something that is universal. I think it can also be tied to a language of the exceptional, right? The unusual. And I suppose that's sort of part and parcel, right? And it's fun. But I think, I think part of the fascination with the grotesque in the Renaissance and, looking back to antiquity was to see that the past was not just about the normative, right? It wasn't just about rules. It was also about circumventing the rules and things that didn't have structure, things that didn't make sense. And I think that irrational part is perhaps what was the point of fascination. So there's certainly, I think, a lot of connections there. And it's monstrous in a good way.
Opened up another avenue.
Sure.
The next one you see.
So usually when the term monstrous is used to describe a world leader, be they male or female, what is being described is not a transgression of social norms, but something, human norms perhaps, right? The maybe Bathory supposedly bathing in blood, or the Belgian Congo, atrocities. How do you separate that use of monstrous from the use of monstrous as the breaking of a social norm?
That's a really great question. And I think in some ways they are not unrelated, which is to say monstrous only makes sense in relationship to the norms, right? The ideal, beauty. And I think for me, you have to see them in a kind of dialectical relationship to one another, right? Certainly, I would not, support monstrous political actions and deeds. However, I think it potentially can be a useful theoretical framework for thinking about things that we've always seen through a single lens. Again, I think I'm most at home in the 18th century, actually not the 17th century, more in the 18th century, which of course is the age of the beautiful ideal, right? It's about perfection. It's about the sort of, the figure, the nude figure as the standard classical ideal. What would it mean to think about the fact that the monstrous is being born as a concept at a parallel moment. Shelley is writing this book on the heels of classical antiquity being upheld as this moral standard. So I think maybe seeing them together perhaps gives us another perspective of seeing an aspect of things that we didn't see before. I don't know if this is too abstract, but I think you raise a really great point, which is the monstrous cannot be an ideal in a way. However, it can be used as a critical stance to question the ideal.
Third one is Linda Need.
Iris, I was trained in the history of the decorative arts, and I was also fortunate enough to go and see your exhibition at the Met, and it is completely eye-opening. We simply never looked at ceramics in the way that you've been looking at them, so thank you for that. But I just wondered if I could you mentioned time as another element in this kind of reading of the water gallery. And I wondered if there was a connection between time and abundance, these towers of ceramics, the way they're displayed, as kind of filling up bored time, of leisure and luxury, unproductive time, being filled in some way with this kind of blue and white ceramics. So, I just wondered if you could say a little bit about time and these women, just filling up time with stuff.
I love that, filling up time with stuff. That sounds like my life. I think that's a really wonderful observation. And I do think you're right in the sense that pleasure dairies are paradoxical, right? Because technically they're supposed to be these sites of labor where you're milking cows and churning butter and you're working, but it's all fake working, right? It's meant to be a form of pleasure. Why else would you have a bathtub next to your dairy, right? It's meant to be this kind of site of relaxation. And I think this notion, for much of Mary's time as queen, William was away. And so she had to kind of rule in his place. And it was this kind of question of how do I fill up my time while William is gone, even though he's technically the head of the country and I'm just filling in for him, right? So I think that the sort of anxiety about that and just needing to fill all these spaces with ceramics, I think there's certainly a kind of connection there. And the other thing too is there is a kind of suspension, right, in a retreat, which is precisely because you don't want to deal with your current times. You escape to this other place where time is suspended. And that's precisely the notion of a pleasure dairy. So that even productivity, right, you're making butter to feed the villagers or whatever, it's not about that kind of productivity, it's about the pleasure of just producing for itself. And I like Defoe's description of this place because he's really specific about everything was done for the queen's specific pleasure, for herself. And that's quite unusual. Obviously, there is a tradition of dairies that European queens had, and Marie Antoinette, of course, being among the most famous versions of that. But there is this idea, though, that she's carving out her own time in a way that isn't tethered to having to rule in William's stead, that I find quite interesting. And she's surrounding herself with her ladies in waiting and replicating them with mirrors, and it's quite wonderful. It doesn't exist anymore, but in our imaginations at least.
Thank you, Iris, for I'm tempted to say an incredibly fecund lecture. I just want to say that just a couple of things right at the end. We're extremely proud to launch the Manton Centre for British Art at the Courtauld. Do look at our website to check out the programme of events that we'll be running from now onwards. So you'll be able to follow the things we're doing, the lectures, the workshops and so forth. The website's up and those events are being listed. We'd like to thank once more the Manton Foundation for their incredibly generous support that's making all of this possible. We're greatly honoured to be able to do this in collaboration with them and to celebrate the legacy of Sir Edwin and Lady Manton. We'd like to thank them, and we'd like to thank Sir Nicholas Sirota for his generous words as well. So thank you all. Come next door and help us celebrate the launch of the centre with a glass of something wet and alcoholic. Thank you.